Well, yesterday I watched a short segment of Freedom Watch on YouTube, which is pretty much the only way I ever watch Freedom Watch, is just the segments on YouTube. And it was an interview with, don't remember his name, he was a former Air Force colonel. I think his last name was Schaefer. Could be wrong. And basically it was about how, this Schaefer fellow was saying Ron Paul is the only candidate who has any kind of sanity when it comes to foreign policy vis-a-vis Iran, which is not why I would make this video, but why I am, because the other thing is he said was that in his view, and he kind of didn't elaborate as to why, but it sounded like this wasn't his opinion so much as something he thought was a fact, that Iran already has nuclear weapons, and he actually specified that he thought that they had 2 nuclear weapons. Now, I don't know this Schaefer character very well. I don't know him at all personally, and I haven't followed him closely enough to know how credible I would put that. If Will Crystal told me that, I would just assume it's a lie. With this guy, I don't know. But that was the second time in 2 days that somebody from the military told me that Iran has a nuclear weapon. The day before that, one of my subscribers, who is a former member of the military, and for all I can tell and for all I believe, was a credible, witness, said the same thing, that it was common knowledge and that he had first-hand knowledge of this, or as first-hand as the military can get. And again, we never know what people are thinking. I don't suspect this either, that my subscriber was lying to me. But it is interesting. Now, this would be different from my previous Iran videos, because it's been my position, and it's still a position I think is at least probable, that Iran neither has a nuclear weapon or is attempting to get one. This is the conclusion that's been put out by the National Intelligence Agencies, their estimate of Iran, by the Non-Proliferation the NEAA, by the UN, and of course the Iranians say the same thing. But these are all government agencies, and so it's possible that they are either just wrong or they're lying. But that to me strikes me as very perplexing, because if both the people who told me, this Schaefer guy and the subscriber, are in the military. So and they are referring to their military experience as the basis for this knowledge. If that's true, then the government must also at least think that Iran has a nuclear weapon. Or, I mean, there's no way that the military would think that it has a nuclear weapon and the rest of the government wouldn't, unless the CIA is convinced it's not true and or some other agency and is I don't know, winning the debates when they talk about it at whatever level. But this strikes me as odd, because there's so much hawkishness towards Iran on the implication that they have a nuclear weapon, but without them actually stating it. So like Michelle Bachmann did say they have a nuclear weapon and they're going to attack Israel. She said if they got one, and that's kind of been the narrative for like a decade now almost, that if they ever got one. But if they already have one and the government knows it, why would they classify it in those terms? Because if Iran actually does have a nuclear weapon, which I kind of hope that they do, then we would never ever go to war with them. If the United States government actually believes that Iran has a nuclear weapon, I think the chances that they would actually go to war with them approach 0. They don't get to 0, but they approach 0. And if that's the case, why are they being so bellicose about it? Why are they being so, provocative towards Iran? I don't know. I don't understand, and I don't know for a fact that they have a nuclear weapon. But if they did, it would put to rest all the stupid claims that, well, if they got a nuke, they'd instantly nuke Israel. Because if they have a nuke, and if they've had one for a while, why haven't they already nuked Israel? Why haven't they invaded any of their neighbors? Why? This doesn't make any sense. I mean, either either they don't have one, all this is hype, or they do have one and they're not using it in the aggressive way that we're led to believe that they automatically would, in which case the fact that they have one is not nearly so dangerous as has been alluded to. And I think that's, either case, which I think we're in a position where either of those has to be true, indicates that a war with Iran is not justifiable. If you look at its neighbor to the east, Pakistan has a fairly unstable government. It has a long list of military dictators. It's a very poor country. It's a very fragmentary country, much more so than Iran. I mean, Iran has minority groups in certain regions that are historically have maybe ties to other areas, especially like the Kurds, and there's some Salafists here and there. But when you look at Pakistan, you have just it's mostly these Hindustani Urdus, but then there's all kinds of Panthans and Pashtuns and Hindus and whatever else, and a lot of history of ethnic violence. Pakistan has been aggressive towards India, which in my view is insane. India is much more powerful than Pakistan is. To have such a, I think the population-wise it's something like a seventh or an eighth the size in terms of wealth. It's probably a bigger disparity, and yet Musharraf, for instance, who was a dictator for a long time, when he was not the dictator but just in the regular military, he actually led an assault on an Indian mountaintop, with this idea that they were going to take over a certain valley in Kashmir. And this is just nuts. I mean, it's David versus Goliath without the moral imperative on David's side. It just doesn't make any sense. And yet, they have a nuclear weapon. They have several nuclear weapons, and they've tested them. And they have yet to attack anybody, people say, well, Iran, they kill American soldiers, in Afghanistan and Iraq. Well, I don't know if that's true. I kind of doubt it, actually. But we know for a fact the ISI from Pakistan funds our enemies in Afghanistan. They fund a whole bunch of people in Afghanistan, including our enemies. Hell, they may have even funded Al-Qaeda just before 9/11, if the reports Alex Jones is so fond of citing are correct, which is actually not implausible if you look at the history. The ISI was supporting groups like Bin Laden's for a long time, which I think is why Jones kind of overstates his point, making it sound like, oh, this is some unique thing where General Ahmed just gives all this money to us. Well, General Ahmed was probably giving money to hundreds of people in Afghanistan. In any event, no one's getting all upset and butthurt that we need to invade Pakistan because they have a nuke and they're killing American soldiers, which they, indirectly are, which is, with the case of Iran, only the allegation. Iran has a very long history, and it hasn't really been an imperial power since the Achaemenids. It's fought defensive wars against the Romans and against the Seleucids and against the Arabs, which it lost, and against Tamerlane and the Ottomans, and but you don't hear about the Shahs invading Turkey or the Shahs invading Iraq or Pakistan. You hear about Saddam invading them, but not the other way around. They have every reason to want a nuclear weapon. Now, I think there's evidence that people in their government, that there's a taboo against it, either because there are religious sanctions against it, or because they're afraid that if they did get one, they would be attacked by the United States. I guess that would be mute if they already had one, though. And again, I keep forgetting to mention this in my Iran videos. One of my subscribers always points out every time I make an Iran video that I forget his name. I'm sorry, sir. He makes the same comment. It's extremely valid one. If Iran is this radical Muslim, theocracy that is just bent on martyrdom, they're not going to fucking nuke Israel, because Israel is full of Muslim shrines. Like, the one in Jerusalem, I think, is the third most important in all of Islam after Mecca and Medina. And the idea that they're these radical Muslims, but then they're going to attack basically third place to Mecca just doesn't ring all that plausible. And the arguments of the neocons fail anyway when they say things like, Well, we can't trust them to be rational. They're not like the Soviets. They're irrational, which I beg to differ. The Soviets were not all that rational much of the time, but they're not rational like the Soviets were, so we can't trust them with a nuke to not just go crazy with it. But then they say, so we need to take a strong stance and intimidate them. You know, well, if they're really that illogical, if they're really homicidal / suicidal / martyrdom-based, you know, like Santorum says, their whole thing is based on martyrdom. They don't need to wait for a nuke, and they're not going to be intimidated by anything. You know, if that's their policy, then us exercising our military might is not going to change that at all. The only thing that would change that would be literally to kill them all, which I think is what some of these people actually want. The other thing here is there's been a lot of talk about their efforts in the Persian Gulf. Now, this is something I think escapes a lot of people. I don't know why. I mean, I learned it when I was, when I was like a 10-year-old, I watched the movie 300 Spartans, and of course in that they fight the Persians, and I kept referring to the Persians, and I remember thinking, well, Persians, they must be a big deal. I went and got my globe and tried to find Persia, and I couldn't find it until I noticed that there's this country in the Middle East, and underneath its name, in parentheses, it said Persia, and the name above that was Iran. Okay, so Iran is Persia, and the Persian Gulf is named after Iran. In English, it has a different name in Arabic, but whatever. It's not an affront to America for the Persians to be doing naval activities in the Persian Gulf. This is not like, say, when China launched a missile from San Diego Bay, which apparently they did a couple months ago. Or when we do war games in the East China Sea or in the Straits of Malacca or something. This is them in their own bag. This would be like the Navy doing maneuvers in, the Gulf of Mexico or Lake Michigan. It's hardly, an aggressive act on their part. And I don't know why people make such a huge deal about it. They're just letting everybody know that they can hurt us if we try and get in a war with them. And they're right. They can close the Straits of Hormuz, which is why this whole war thing is stupid. Now, I do not understand the people in power. If you follow them long enough, you do realize that they can't be characterized in one particular way because they have different ideologies. So I think that there are some people who really believe in this whole strategic chess game kind of grand chessboard. It's the big new Brzezinski geopolitical strategizing, where they go. That's not a word, but whatever. Where they look at they look at each country like a board on a section of a game board, and it's like, how do we get this guy? If we take over this area and this mountain pass, and we'll be able to affect the pipeline that goes to that place, and then we'll be able to affect the minority status in this one province, and blah 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 blah, and on and on. And they really like playing that. I think it's a vicarious thing. They maybe think it's good for this country. A lot of people think that an active government involvement in world affairs is necessary for prosperity, which is, of course, absurd. There are lots of countries whose governments are completely non-active in foreign affairs that are extremely wealthy. The most obvious example is Switzerland, but there's a whole bunch of microstates in Europe. This also applies, like Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, a whole bunch of little islands. And, if you go back in our history, we were doing just fine before our government was going around the world trying to solve the world's problems. In fact, we went from a small colonial agrarian society to the richest society in history during that period, which escapes a lot of people, apparently. And this is where, I think people like Charles Krauthammer and probably Brzezinski and a couple of people are like this. But then there are others who I think are a little bit more cynical, where they either are just blatant war profiteers, which, I'm a huge gun enthusiast. There's nothing wrong with weaponry per se. I wish there was more weaponry in society and that it was just a little bit more evenly distributed so that the government didn't have a monopoly on so much of it. But to make money because you're selling this stuff with getting paid in tax dollars, with the idea that they're going to be used to kill people for basically no good reason. That's bad. And so there's that, and then there's also just the politicians who they gain politically, not necessarily directly financially. So Obama doesn't have to have stock in Raytheon or Lockheed Martin, although he'll probably get campaign contributions from them. He can just be the war president. He can be the man on the white horse. And this is a continuity with states. There's a few exceptions to this, but not many. That war is their main function. This is their main justification, and it's what they glory in. You know, a king has to be seen as a successful war person. It doesn't matter if he fails at being a good warrior, or at least being perceived as a good warrior. You know, his public work projects are just going to be seen as poor substitution. And our presidents are no different. They want to be seen as war leaders. And this goes, I mean, you look at the Athenian democracy, which is really just an empire, the Spartans, the Romans. You know, there are exceptions. Sometimes if you have a state that is in a precarious position where it could never hope to defend itself against its rivals, you know, they might forswear really going for the military thing. So some of the Baltic states, like Estonia, might be like this, or the Somni, or, you know, there's a couple examples, but it's kind of a rare thing. If they have a big enough host to be a parasite off of that they can field an army, they're probably going to want to do it, and they're going to want to use that army to show off how tough they are. And it does. It secures their support. It shuts up the opposition. It makes everyone into a good, obedient patriot. I mean, the government relies on ideology so much, and it amps up the fear, and it gets all that tribal identification that we have with the group. You know, extrapolating our relatively small kin attachments to like this whole country with hundreds of millions of people, and it's really good for them, and so that's why they like it so much. And I mean, it's good for the Iranian government too, to the extent that the Iranian government doesn't get annihilated. You know, who knows if the United States had been conciliatory and nice this whole time, if Ahmadinejad would still be in power. I mean, that's speculation. I'm not predicting that that's what would have happened. You know, Iranians are fairly secular relative to a lot of people, relative to our allies like Saudi Arabia, that's for sure. But when we are, you know, pounding at the gate, so to speak, that doesn't make people think that they should change the guard. That makes people think that they should just obey the guard and do whatever they're told. And I don't know. I don't understand. Like, I do think there's a case to be made. The incentives are such that although it may appear to be insane to any rational person, it makes sense because the horrible things that will happen in the war are going to either not affect the political class or they're going to affect them much less than they do the rest of us. But this is not true in Iran. If there was a war with the United States, you know, the Iranian regime would be in danger at some level. It depends on the degree that we get involved. If we just shoot a couple missiles, that's not going to do it. But if we try to seriously take them down, that would be bad for them. Not because they'd lose support among the people, but just because, you know, they'd be destroyed. And so they have a stronger incentive not to start a war than, say, the U.S. government. I still think, though, well, reasonably, the U.S. government should know better. But, you know, we can't give government that much credit, I'm sorry to say. So, all right. If anyone knows, has anyone else heard? I mean, other than like Michelle Bachmann saying that Iran is going to get a nuke or whatever, something a little bit more credible than that, I'd be interested to hear it. All right, that's it.